So we're going to be talking about consent, and it is focusing on the curriculum that we teach through Consent Academy. We have lots of events. You're welcome to attend any or all of them. They often have a donation-based sliding scale so that we have low barriers for participation. Generally, we believe that consent is part of everyday life. It is essential. While it is sexy, that is secondary to that it is essential. And it is for everyone. And we need to practice because we make mistakes, like I did yesterday. And hopefully we'll make new mistakes instead of repeating the old ones. And so the first piece is dualism. This idea of yes, no, right, and wrong. So I have this little image of a piece of paper. A piece of paper has one side and the other side, and yeah, you could maybe split that piece of paper in half, but generally speaking, it really truly only has two sides to it. Most of the rest of life isn't like that. It's not a binary. The dualism doesn't work of the yeses and nos and goods and bads. And in a litigious society, we kind of get stuck there. And so I'm going to encourage you to think more along the ideas of spectrum. And so this is a Mobius strip, which is how I like to think of things that often have a dualistic idea to them. That yes, within sort of one axis of that Mobius strip, you might have the 100% yes over here, and you might have 100% no. But throughout your day, week, and lifetime, you're going to shift where you are in this spectrum. And so you could substitute the yes and no for masculine, feminine, for many other aspects of your sexual life. But to think of all these things within a spectrum instead of a binary. And that's basically because feelings are not always facts. And facts, it's maybe rare if a fact is ever truly a fact. That when we're talking about sexuality, we're talking about feelings. We're talking about the subjective experience. And so consent, and Ash, I know how much you love etymology, so you're welcome to jump in. Consent meaning with feeling. And so that's not just with your feelings, it's with feelings of everyone in the room concurrently. So the 1, 2, or 20 people you're talking about, it's about being with all of those people's feelings all at the same time. There's a little cartoon in the bottom corner of these two people looking at something that's painted on the floor. The one person, it looks like a 9. The other person, it looks like a 6. They are both 100% correct and 100% wrong at the same time. They could talk about this until the cows come home, and they will never be right or wrong because they're from different perspectives. And that's what the consent thing is really about. It's about understanding the validity of each person's perspective, whether you agree with it or not, whether you consider it to be factual or not. And that's about the intent versus impact, right? Like when I made a mistake yesterday, I had an intent of why I did what I did. The impact potentially created harm, and that's not okay. And so we tend to judge ourselves by our intent. You know, one might start to defend themselves. But then what the other person, you tend to think about that as far as the impact. So there's this little cartoon in the bottom corner, these two people walking down the street and doing their little chatty chat, having a lovely day, talking about whatever they're talking about. Maybe they're talking about how awesome the star was, how they learned all these things. And so they weren't necessarily paying attention to everything out there. And so this other person quietly sitting there reading a book on the stone, when they walked up and they stepped on their toe, it hurt. It sucked. It didn't feel good to them. They literally had an impact. So the people walking might be like, well, I didn't mean to step on your toe. Well, that's true, but you did step on the toe. And the reality was the toe was stepped on and it's throbbing and it's hurting. And to focus on that, to focus on the reality of that harm, the reality of the impact, which is that person's foot and their toes throbbing and hurting. And to not to invalidate that by saying that it wasn't your intent. And so really just thinking about intent, impact as you're going throughout your life. If there are moments that you're feeling defensive, the moments that you try to justify it or you're reactionary, really try to consider that. And that's where breathing comes in, taking a deep breath around that. Pondering, maybe there's another perspective beyond mine. And so some of us live in the Pacific Northwest. I grew up in Philadelphia, which might be called the city of brotherly love, but believe me, when I was growing up there, it certainly was not. It was a place of mugging and violence, which is why I moved to the West Coast. And so I did not grow up in a place where people hugged. If people came near you, it's probably because they were going to knife you or take your money. And so there's this piece of me deep down inside that still kind of has that fear when someone approaches me. So I've been living here since 94. So, and now I'm a hugger. And so if I see you, I potentially will offer to share a hug with you if you want me to. But that doesn't mean that you want to receive a hug, right? And so the intent of running up to someone all full of love that you want to give someone a hug, that might be lovely intent, but the other person might feel like you're a bear about to attack them and devour them, right? They didn't necessarily ask for the hug, even though it was a lovely intent. The impact was a charging bear. So next piece of this is risk profile. So it's really important to understand your risk profile. So what are the things you're willing to take on? You know, when you were thinking about taking a SAR, you might have heard rumors about, oh, SARs are really traumatizing. And our intent was this whole like, oh, refreshing glass of water, but it's also a lot of information. And it's a lot of information in 14 hours. And so in your risk profile, like where were you on that? Did you have all the water you needed lined up? Did you have snacks? Did you have friend on speed dial if you needed it to be able to talk about something, decompress about something? Like what are the potential risks, potential problems that might come up? And are you comfortable 100% accepting of the worst case scenario? If things go horribly wrong, if you're going to go bungee jumping, are you okay with going splat? I talk about going through cancer and being told that because of modern medicine that I had to do chemo, I had to do surgery, I had to do radiation. If I did not do the trifecta, I would die. Every doctor I talked to told me the same thing. I refused radiation. My family and friends were not okay with me potentially dying, but I was not willing to do radiation, and I didn't want to die, but I wasn't willing to take the risk associated with radiation, and I recognized that might cause me to die. I'm here, get worked out, so, but being fully accepting of that risk. And are there ways to minimize it, right? So for like me, I found other ways to go about it. I switched to a ketogenic diet. I really truly adhered to the chemotherapy regimen. Bungee cording, maybe you take some videos, or maybe you make sure that you don't eat something really sloshy in your belly so you don't vomit. Like what are the things that you can do to minimize your risk? And maybe you can do things incrementally. So maybe for bungee jumping, maybe you just put on a harness and see if it's comfortable. Maybe you rappel down a 3-foot rock before you jump off a 100-foot bridge. What are the ways you can incrementally approach that risk? So the Consent Academy, I think we're spectacular and I think we do wonderful work, but there are many other people doing amazing work. And please find the things that help you, that support you, that work for you. These are 4 ones I want to put out, which I think are also awesome. So there's the Robot Hug has a cartoon. It's kind of like the Calvin Hobbes level cartoon. It is not language that a 3-year-old will understand, but maybe a tween or older will probably understand all the language. But it's spectacular. It gets into all of the nuance. I'm not saying the Consent Academy is based on the Consent Castle cartoon, but there's definitely a lot of crossover, and kids can love cartoons, so that can be really fun. The Consent Tea video by Blue Seat Studios, it has gone viral. People tend to love it. It's primarily about capacity. It's primarily about this whole idea that if you make yummy tea, that's great, but if someone's passed out or dead, they probably don't want your tea, no matter how good it is. They've also, since going viral, they've also done new videos, which are actually targeting like little 3-year-olds and other populations. And so they have a bunch of them out there. Betty Martin, who is in the Pacific Northwest, Betty Martin is the one who is very much alive and doing amazing work. They do the Wheel of Consent, which I highly recommend. It is very deep. It has a lot of complexity, which I love as a consent geek. please do take a look at their website and their handouts and all their videos. And then fries. In the Pacific Northwest, it's become very popular. FRI stands for F, being freely given, R, reversible, I, informed, E, enthusiastic, and S, specific. I specifically want to draw attention to the reversibility piece of that. The way I like to think of reversibility is that if you give me consent right now, that doesn't mean that I have your consent in 5 minutes or 5 days. If you say I can borrow your car today, that does not mean I can borrow your car next week. However, the retroactive aspect of reversibility can get a little sticky. I personally do not have access to a time machine. So I recognize that I did harm yesterday, but I can't go back in time and take back my words. And so if you gave me consent around something and you feel bad about something, you can't necessarily go back in time to reverse your consent and say you no longer have consent. And so if someone did something which made you not feel so great, you can talk about it in the present moment. You can discuss it. You can revoke it now so that it won't be repeated in the future. But it's the time aspect that can get a little sticky there. And so just hopefully people can think about that if you are a huge fan of the Fry's model. Consent Academy basically focuses on these 5 things: autonomy, capacity, information, agreements and boundaries, and then agency and power differentials. We could talk about each one of these for 5 days. I will talk about each one for like a minute and a half. So autonomy is the first one. I love autonomy. I live in the Pacific Northwest. I am a highly liberal and privileged individual. Autonomy is part of the liberal mindset, is part of liberal privilege. It is not part of the entire world. There are many collectivist cultures around the planet that autonomy is not part of the culture. And so part of why it is first is because you might not want to jump on board with the autonomy thing. And so please ignore this part and focus on the rest. But autonomy is about everyone's intrinsic right to decide what is best for your mind, your body, your spirit, and story, and information for a specific duration of time, right? So at the beginning of the story, we talked about sharing information and creating brave space. And part of that was if someone shares something, such as like I shared a story about my cancer, that I'm sharing it with you now. I'm not giving you permission to say, hey, Frederick went through cancer and this, that, and the other next week when you're talking to someone else, right? If it helped you in some way and it was supportive of you in some way, then the information, that the enthusiasm, the inspiration, bring that with you, but not the Frederick part, not the specifics about Frederick going through cancer. And some might extend this to personal property, right? So maybe your cell phone or the car example. And so are you okay with me picking up your cell phone and calling someone? What if I call Paris? What if I talk to someone for 20 hours? Like what is okay with you around personal property? And then in the sexy world, some people like to be considered property. Like personally, I like feeling a type of connection with a partner that I like feeling owned. Not in a property sort of degrading way, but I like feeling an ownership type connection with my partners. And so for me, that brings me joy. And so I give authority to my partners that they are allowed to consider me part of them, that they are allowed to consider me as an extension of them, and therefore they are allowed to be part of a discussion around other people having access to me. And then boundaries are how we can enforce that autonomy, how we can explore others' autonomy. I think of it as like a soap bubble around me, a soap bubble around another person. And as we start exploring and engaging in different ways, the soap bubbles push on each other, and potentially we can start understanding the nuance of each other, the nuance of our boundaries, the nuances of what the information fully is versus maybe the first word or two. Next piece is capacity, which is basically that whole consent T video. It exists on a spectrum. So passed out drunk on the floor, that is when you are incapacitated. Incapacitated tends to be pretty clear. The idea of being fully capable, I honestly don't know if it ever exists. Maybe after you've had a really good night's sleep and you had some yummy food the last night and the temperature is just right and you slept really well, maybe the first 30 seconds of your day you are in fact 100% capable. But as soon as you start feeling some stresses in life, you're probably going to be at least some part of diminished capacity. And having that diminished capacity affects the way that we engage in things. There's this awesome acronym that Ash taught me, which is HALTS. That stands for hungry, the H being hungry, but also in the sexy world, that H can stand for horny. Maybe you're A, angry, or L, lonely, T, tired, or S, sick. And so what are ways capacity can be affected on the physical level? Are there substances that you enjoy having in your life? Do you enjoy marijuana? Do you enjoy ecstasy? Do you enjoy alcohol? Are you aware of how that affects your body and different bodies? And potentially one drink is maybe different for one person's body than someone else that maybe would be affected in a similar way 3 or 5 drinks. Are you accepting of and joyful of how that affects your body and how it affects your capacity to make decisions around things? Emotionally, maybe you're aroused, sexually aroused, or maybe something that someone says or does, it charges you in some way, it activates you in some way, that potentially can affect your capacity. Mental health, there are a lot of people that are potentially going to be coming to you for work around depression. There's a lot of stigma around depression. I'm of the sense that depression is actually pretty normal. There is a range of depression, but I personally feel that we all feel a level of depression at any point in time. And I'm a fan of normalizing depression, but still providing support to people that are seeking support or maybe that don't have the capacity to ask for support because of their diminished capacity around depression. So my anxiety, like maybe you're like, oh, wow, the last 2 days were really intense. Well, luckily today's only 4 hours, but still maybe you have anxiety around that, or maybe you have anxiety about it being over 100 degrees today. Or maybe there's a past trauma. These are all things that can be part of that. And in the cognitive sense, there could be neural diversity, that there could be language differences. If I say the word apple, maybe Shanna's going to think of iPhone, and maybe Tina's going to think of applesauce, and maybe I thought of some other entirely different apple, right? So the semantics of things, the cognitive difference between us, the enthusiasm that we bring to things, the joy, the past stories that we bring, these cognitive differences really affect us quite a lot. And so this stuff is linked in with information agency and power differentials, which we'll talk about a little bit more. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to kind of skip the Q&A part right now, but do consider, has there been a time where you've said yes to something because of a reduced capacity? Like the last year of COVID, perhaps, where you've been getting, I know I've been feeling lonely. And so that feeling lonely, that there are things I'm like, oh yeah, I'd love to hang out with someone, but maybe if I didn't feel so lonely, I wouldn't want to hang out with them so much. So, these things can affect us. Next piece is information. And so does everyone involved fully understand everything, both the nature of the request and the potential risks that are associated with that? Like if we were in person, potentially I may be like, hey, you could have 3 volunteers and maybe a bunch of people would volunteer, but I didn't say what I was asking you to volunteer for. You might have through enthusiasm raised your hand. Next thing you know, you're on stage. But I didn't give you all the information. And maybe it's a similar thing, right? The bungee jumping, if I've gone bungee jumping 100 times, I know more of the nuance around that. And if I tell you, hey, let's go bungee jumping, you might not have all the information. You might not know that you need to change what you eat beforehand. You might not know the aftercare you need in case you might have some bruises from the harness. So can people share the information fully in an open way, in a fully honest way? Do you have a shared language? Like, are you literally speaking like English versus French versus German versus Spanish? Are there actual different languages that you're speaking? Do you have different dialectics because of like different parts of the country? Or the different paths in your lives and some of the terminology that you each use or familiarity with terminology because of being part of the sex positive scene for a while or something like that. So please be really, really specific and ask lots and lots of questions. I am a huge fan of people asking more questions than not. It helps me feel that I can trust them because if they are asking me questions, then I know that if I say something that they don't understand, they're going to ask me about it. Because I might make an assumption and think that people know what apple I'm thinking about inside of my head. This is also linked with capacity. So another thing to ponder, has there been a time where you said yes to something because you didn't fully understand the information? Like, for instance, you're going to take a SAR, and yes, we gave you a syllabus, but did you understand 100% of everything? What, were you comfortable with the risk that was going into the SAR, having as much information as you had? Maybe not every piece. I tried my best to flood you with information, but maybe there are parts that you needed. Maybe next time you go like, hey, Frederick, could you give me a little bit more information around that next time? Or if a boss asks you to stay late for work, does that mean they want you to stay 5 minutes late or 5 days late, right? Maybe you had dinner plans and 5 minutes is cool, but 2 hours, that's going to impact your dinner date. Or maybe you're diabetic and your blood sugar is going to drop. So what are the impacts if you don't have all that information? Next piece being agreements and boundaries. So are things explicit or implicit? So I like to use an example about a barista. In Pacific Northwest, a lot of people love their coffee. Maybe right now, because it's a little warmer, you're drinking iced coffee. So maybe there's a coffee shop you love to go to, and the first time you walk in, you're like, hey, could I have my triple mocha latte or whatever the thing is you love? And the next time, the barista kind of recognizes you, but you still are like, hey, could I have my triple mocha latte? And you've been going there now for a couple of weeks, and you walk in and all day long, you've been like, I'm so looking forward to a hot cocoa, or, it's actually really hot today, so I really want an iced frappuccino. And you walk in, and the barista's like, hey, I made you your triple mocha latte. And you're like, but I want an iced frappuccino. Now, maybe you'll be highly upset about that. Maybe you'll be okay about that. I don't know. But that's an implicit agreement, right? That you've gotten that triple mocha latte every other time, and so they're assuming that it's going to be okay, and they're making an assumption and taking action on that, but it wasn't explicit. They didn't ask you every time for what the beverage is, or the car keys, or maybe holding someone's hand, or giving someone a kiss, or maybe you're kissing someone now in front of their parents or in front of their colleagues. Like, do you need to re-up your information? Do you need to ask some more questions because it's now a different situation? So the least risky kind of agreement is when it is explicit and fully articulated, and that agreement is made where it's freely given and without coercion. So like can you stay late for work? There might be fear that if you don't say yes, you might get fired. And so is your boss willing to have a conversation around that? Are they willing to recognize their power authority over you about possibly firing you if you don't stay late for 5 minutes or for 5 days? And recognizing that if there is a form of coercion, chances are there's going to be hard feelings. It's almost like a guaranteed way for consent to be violated to at least some level if there's a form of coercion. And so recognize that boundaries do change over time, right? Like it's hotter out, so you now want your iced frappuccino. And they don't need to be explained. You don't need to explain to the barista why you want a different beverage. You don't need to explain to your partner why you don't want them to kiss you right now or why you don't want them to hold your hand right now. You just don't want that right now. End of story. No is all you have to say. No is awesome. Personally, I think no is even sexier than a yes, because when I hear a no, I then can trust that someone will say no in the future. And so I love to help people practice saying no. Even if you're practicing saying no to something you would actually be saying yes to, it's just a great practice to practice saying no. So no is a full sentence, but I'm also a huge fan of expanding it beyond that, right? So like, no, but I'd rather. So like, no, I don't want to hold your hand right now, but I'd love it if you held my arm or we walked arm in arm or something like that. Or no, I don't want you to hold my hand right now, but the idea that you asking me is really romantic, so thank you. Or the yes but of, yeah, holding hands would be cool, but actually, I kind of like to make out with you a bunch right now. Could we do that? What do you think? Or, yeah, holding hands right now would be great, but my hands are kind of sweaty, so instead of holding hands, could we like do more like an arm in arm or like hand around the shoulder kind of thing? Because then you won't be holding my sweaty hand on this hot day. So I'm a huge fan of unpacking stuff. Agency and power differentials. This is one of my huge geeky things. I will please, if you want, I will talk to you for hours and hours on this one. I talked with you about this around intersectionality. I talked with you about this about a number of different things. But basically, the power differentials are any time that you might perceive or really truly feel in your body that another person potentially might be, quote unquote, ahead of you in some manner, or potentially that you might be in some type of a privilege or position that another person might perceive you, or you might assume that you're ahead of another person. There are many ways that can happen. Some of them are age, bodily or cognitive ability, citizenship, class and money. For instance, like that's part of why we have the field growth scholarship, because it's a real genuine thing. I love ASECT in many ways, but there are a lot of costs associated with ASECT. And we want to have more people in the field that are affected by money. And so that's why we have the field growth scholarship. Experience might be a thing. Fame might be a thing. And so if you ever attend a Consent Academy event in person, we'll give people these different pebbles, and we'll ask people to, if you feel that you have more or less of this aspect of power than the other person, if the other person has more than you're perceiving as more, give the other person one of the pebbles. And when this exercise is done, pretty much never are people having the same number of pebbles at the end. Because of mathematics, at the end, one person always has at least two more pebbles than the other. And it's those even subtle differences, even if there are a number of things that seem to be similar, and you might think that people are equal, equality, I would say, never exists. We can create equity. We can create support structures. We can recognize power differentials. We can recognize privilege. We can try to do work around that. But equality is maybe an impossibility, but we can very actively work towards equity and being aware of the elephants in the corner of the room, being aware of the power differentials and trying to address those in different ways. And so this afternoon, as we're talking more, we're going to be spending hours where we're going to be talking about how to mitigate power differentials, how to have ethical practices that mitigate this. I really hope that you will think about these things. And I can't put it in the chat right now, but I will put it in the chat so that potentially we can talk about these things in group if we want. And so if we cannot avoid violating consent, unfortunately, what happens when consent is violated, right? What are some of the things that you can do around consent being violated? So you can own the mistake, right? And I would recommend to honestly apologize and owning that mistake if you genuinely feel that. Don't apologize or own a mistake because you think you're supposed to. People might believe that you're apologizing, but if you're not genuine, I think most people will recognize that. And if you're not sincere, it's not really as helpful. And so maybe you need to take a deep breath. Maybe you need to process something for a day or two until you will recognize that you've made that mistake, until you will recognize the harm you created, because maybe you're in a reactionary place. Maybe you're stuck with your intent. But if you can, own that mistake, apologize honestly, and then ask how to make amends and attempt repair. This is not about you. If you created harm, this is not about you doing the thing to make yourself feel better. If I did something, and I apologize, but I'm just seeing you on my video monitor, so I would say, if I harmed Shanna in some way, that maybe I'm like, oh, I'm going to get Shanna a dozen roses and that'll make Shanna feel better. It's going to be awesome. But maybe Shanna's allergic to roses. Or maybe Shanna just wants me to shut up and not talk to me for a week, right? Maybe the first thing I need to be like, hey, I messed up. Is there something that I could do that would be meaningful and significant to you that would help you understand that I messed up and I care about you and I want to make amends? And maybe Shanna will be like, yeah, buy me a car. Or maybe a cup of coffee. But basically, let it focus on the person who is harmed. Let that person guide things. That's the trauma focus that we talk about with like Van der Kolk's work of your body holding trauma, really focusing on the trauma and how the person who was traumatized, how they can be supported and how they can form and navigate that path towards healing. If you need to update your consent framework, maybe you went to kiss someone and you didn't realize that kissing them in front of their parents was bad. I don't know, maybe they were in the closet with their parents and you didn't know that because they're all like pride fests all the time and everything all over Facebook, but their parents don't do the internet thing. So that's why they feel comfortable being all over the internet. But in front of their parents, like, yeah, don't hold my hand or kiss me. My parents will freak out. So update the consent framework, whatever the thing is. Or maybe you only bars the car when someone specifically gives me those car keys. And try to do better. Try to not make mistakes, but if you are, try to make new mistakes. There's a range of consent incidents. Something could be a disagreement, or a conflict, or a harm, or hurt, or abuse. I tend to think of the disagreement kind of like the barista, making you that triple mocha latte into the frappuccino. Maybe the world's not going to end. Maybe you can have a small little chatty chat. Everything's going to be okay. Abuse is kind of more on the side where you start having lawyers and start having prisons. So there's kind of this spectrum of things. And the more on one side of the spectrum you are than the other, the potentially more complicated the process will be. So a couple of things for you to consider. Maybe some of the goals that you could have for your own consent practice, and focusing on the word practice. It is something you need to do over and over again so that you can only make new mistakes. So what does autonomy mean to you? What are good boundary settings look like to you? How might you mitigate power differentials? How have you agreed to something and then wish you had more information beforehand? How can you foster clear communication? How can you minimize consent incidents or risks? How can you address those disagreements, conflict, hurt, harm, and abuse? And what do you think a consensual agreement looks like in the first place? Maybe something that it's working for you and what you would sort of put forward in a role model might be different from another person. Let's start with you and figure out what works for you, and then you can have a conversation with someone else. If you do go to a play party, you potentially are going to, this is not the waiver from Sanctuary, this is a waiver from when I do events, but this is kind of what a consent waiver looks like. I recommend if you go to a venue, read the consent waiver. We're in such a habit of just clicking the button or signing a form. Read the consent waiver because, it might require you to buy a Ferrari for Shanna and you might not be able to afford that. Once again, so the Consent Academy, from the boardroom to the bedroom, every day, and practice. I put some links in there for events that we have. We have Consent Basics, which is basically the same thing, but over an hour and a half with a little bit more time and space to really talk about things, really go into things. Lots of other events. Please do take a look. Of course, we're also a 501c3, so you're welcome to give us donations because, that helps keep the lights on, literally. And we have a book. You can buy it at your local bookshop. You can buy it from the website. I think the last time I looked, it was around $20 US. I personally think it's spectacular, but I'm also a little biased.